Staten Island, October 1929. A young man is dragged from a car, blindfolded, hands tied behind his back. They take him to an abandoned warehouse on the waterfront, the kind of place where the river swallows sound and nobody asks questions in the morning. For hours, they beat him. They slash his face with a knife, long and slow, the way you do something when you want a man to remember it for the rest of his life. They hang him from a meat hook by his wrists and leave him there in the dark. He is still alive when they find him, and that survival, that single, stubborn, inexplicable fact, will change American history forever. Because the man they tried to kill that night doesn't run. He doesn't hide. He doesn't disappear into some quiet corner of the country and spend the rest of his life grateful to be breathing. Instead, over the next 2 years, he dismantles the entire structure of organized crime in America and rebuilds it from the ground up, more powerful, more efficient, and more dangerous than anything that had existed before. His name is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and this is the story of how a 9-year-old boy from a Sicilian mining town became the most powerful criminal in the history of the modern world, and how the United States government eventually came to him in prison, hat in hand, and asked for his help. Subscribe right now and don't miss other stories just like this one. Every week, we go deep into the world of crime, power, and the men who shaped history from the shadows. The story doesn't begin in New York. It begins in the dust and silence of a town called Lercara Fridi, in the hills of western Sicily, in the province of Palermo. The year is 1897. A boy is born into a family that knows nothing but poverty and sulfur dust. His father, Antonio, works in the local sulfur mines, grinding, dangerous work that pays almost nothing and slowly destroys the men who do it. His mother, Rosalia, raises 5 children in a house where food is never guaranteed, and the future holds exactly one promise: more of the same. The boy's name is Salvatore Lucania. Not Charles, not Lucky, not any of the names the world will eventually know him by. Just Salvatore, a name that belongs to the old country, to the dust and the poverty and the silence of a place the rest of the world has forgotten. Sicily at the end of the 19th century is not simply poor. It is a place where the official government has failed so completely, so visibly, so insultingly, that another system has risen to fill the void. The Mafia, or more precisely, the Cosa Nostra, isn't just a criminal organization in this period. It is a parallel government. It settles disputes between neighbors. It enforces contracts that the courts won't touch. It protects businesses from theft, for a price, always for a price. And it demands loyalty in return for that protection, with an absoluteness that no elected official can match. For a boy growing up in Lercara Fridi, the men of respect aren't criminals. They're the only authority that actually functions. That lesson, that real power belongs to whoever is willing to take it and hold it, regardless of what the law says, is the first and most important thing Salvatore Lucania ever absorbs. He doesn't learn it from a book. He learns it from watching which men in his town walk with their heads up and which ones look at the ground. In 1906, when Salvatore is 9 years old, the Lucania family does what hundreds of thousands of Sicilian families are doing in those years. They pack what little they have, board a ship at Palermo, and sail for America. They arrive at Ellis Island, processed through the enormous grinding machinery of immigration, tagged and examined and waved through, and settle on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The neighborhood already has a name by then: Little Italy. It is loud, relentlessly crowded, smelling of garlic and fish and garbage and something else underneath all of that: ambition, raw and unsorted. The ambition of people who have left everything behind and have nothing to lose. It is exactly the kind of place where a boy from nowhere can either disappear entirely or become something extraordinary. Salvatore Lucania, 9 years old, with nothing in his pockets and everything ahead of him, chooses the second option immediately. He is enrolled in school. School bores him, not because he isn't intelligent, but because the classroom offers him nothing he can use. What he wants is not arithmetic and spelling. What he wants is what he sees outside the window: the street, the movement, the constant negotiation of a neighborhood where every block has its own hierarchy, and every hierarchy has cracks a smart boy can climb through. He is 10 years old when he runs his first operation. It is small, almost laughably so. A protection racket aimed at Jewish kids in the neighborhood, charging them a penny a day to walk them to school without being beaten up. The mechanics are crude. The principle is pure Luciano. Identify something people need, control the supply of it, and charge accordingly. But one boy refuses to pay. He is small, unremarkable looking, with quiet eyes that take in everything and give back nothing. He stands in front of Salvatore on a Lower East Side street and says, simply and without fear, "I don't need your protection." Salvatore looks at him for a long moment. "What's your name?" he asks. "Meyer," the boy says. "Meyer Lansky." Luciano is so struck by the refusal, by the absolute, calm fearlessness of it, that he doesn't fight the boy. He befriends him. It is one of the most consequential decisions of his life. Lansky's financial mind, precise, systematic, almost inhuman in its ability to see the structure beneath the chaos, combined with Luciano's street authority and physical presence, will become one of the most effective criminal partnerships in American history. A partnership that lasts for decades, built on a single act of defiance on a sidewalk. Through Lansky, he meets others: Bugsy Siegel, violent, magnetic, the kind of person who makes you nervous and fascinated in equal measure. Frank Costello, smooth, politically aware even at 14, already understanding instinctively that the real power in New York isn't on the street, it's in the offices and courtrooms and dinner parties where decisions about the street are made. These boys are not friends in the ordinary sense. They are allies. And in the world Salvatore Lucania is building in his head, allies are everything. By 1907, Salvatore is 10 years old. He already has a record with the police. By the time he is 18, the record has grown, and so has the reputation. He drops out of school, works briefly as an errand boy at a hat factory on Fifth Avenue, and quits within months. Legitimate work cannot compete. The mathematics are too simple. The streets offer 10 times the money for half the boredom, and the only cost is risk. And risk, to a boy who grew up watching men of respect walk through Lercara Fridi like they own the dust, is not a deterrent. It is the point. He is noticed in these years by an older man, a squat, heavy, thoroughly old-world Sicilian named Giuseppe Masseria, who goes by the name Joe the Boss, and who, by the early 1910s, controls a significant portion of the Italian criminal world in Manhattan, with the combination of brute authority and zero imagination that defines a certain kind of powerful man. Masseria sees in the young Luciano a useful soldier. Loyal, fearless, intelligent enough to be given real responsibilities. What Masseria doesn't see, because he is constitutionally incapable of seeing it, is that Salvatore Lucania is already thinking about a world that doesn't have Joe Masseria in it. By his early 20s, Salvatore has shed his name the way a man sheds clothes that no longer fit. He is Charlie Luciano now, Americanized, presentable, comfortable in rooms that a Sicilian immigrant son has no business being comfortable in. He dresses well, not flashily, not in the way of men who want to be noticed, but with the quiet precision of someone who understands that how you present yourself is a form of communication. He speaks carefully. He listens more than he talks. In a world full of men who shout to establish dominance, Charlie Luciano establishes it by being the calmest person in the room. He moves through both the Italian underworld and the wider criminal ecosystem of New York: Jewish gangs, Irish gangs, political machines, police precincts, with a naturalness that most of his peers simply cannot match. Most Italian gangsters of this period are deeply suspicious of anyone who isn't Sicilian, anyone who wasn't born into the tradition. Luciano finds this not just wrong, but strategically stupid. The best thief in New York might be Jewish. The most useful police captain might be Irish. Refusing to work with them on the basis of where their grandfather was born is leaving money and power on the table. He works, during the early Prohibition years, with a man named Arnold Rothstein, the most sophisticated criminal mind in New York, a gambler and fixer and financier who treats crime the way a merchant bank treats investments, with analysis, patience, and absolute emotional detachment. Rothstein is the man who fixes the 1919 World Series. He is also the man who teaches Charlie Luciano things that no street education can provide. How to think in systems rather than incidents. How to move money so it cannot be traced. How to corrupt institutions from the inside rather than fight them from the outside. Most importantly, he introduces Luciano to the upper echelons of New York: politicians, judges, newspaper editors, police commissioners. Men whose cooperation is worth more in the long run than 100 soldiers with guns. Luciano absorbs it all. He is, above everything else, a student. And what he is studying is power in every form it takes. And then Prohibition arrives, and everything he has been studying suddenly becomes worth an almost incomprehensible amount of money. January 16, 1920. The Volstead Act takes effect, and overnight, the United States government creates the greatest criminal business opportunity in history. Alcohol, the single most widely consumed recreational substance in the country, woven into the fabric of daily life for millions of Americans, becomes illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell. The demand doesn't disappear. Demand of this kind never disappears. It simply redirects itself, completely and immediately, toward whoever is willing to supply it outside the law. The criminal organizations of New York understand what this means within hours. The money is going to be staggering. The only question is, who gets it? In the early years, the answer is chaos. Gangs fight over supply routes and distribution territories. Bootleg shipments are hijacked on the highway. Men are killed over individual city blocks. It is violent, wasteful, and breathtakingly inefficient. And Charlie Luciano, watching all of it with his characteristic cold assessment, finds it almost philosophically offensive. "This is no way to run a business," he tells Lansky during one of their regular meetings in a back room in Lower Manhattan. "These men are burning down money to fight over money. You can't build anything this way." Lansky, who has been running the numbers with the precision he applies to everything, doesn't disagree. "So what do you want to do about it?" "I want to make it stop," Luciano says. "Not by winning the war, by ending the logic that makes the war necessary." It will take him a decade to fully execute that idea, but the idea itself, crime as a rational enterprise, violence as a failure of management rather than an expression of power, is already complete in his mind by the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, Luciano is running bootlegging operations of considerable scale. He is also running gambling and prostitution, but bootlegging is where the real money is, and real money means real influence. He commands a crew. He has alliances across ethnic lines. He has relationships with politicians and police. And he is beginning to articulate, to a small circle of trusted men, a vision for what organized crime in America could look like if someone with enough intelligence and nerve were to build it properly. The vision is simple. Crime should operate like a corporation, not a feudal structure of bosses demanding tribute from vassals, not a collection of street gangs fighting over corners. A corporation with territories defined by negotiation rather than bloodshed, with profits distributed rationally, with violence reserved for situations where every other tool has already failed. A corporation in which competence matters more than bloodline. This vision makes him dangerous. Specifically, it makes him dangerous to the two men who currently sit at the top of the Italian-American underworld, and who are, by the late 1920s, about to drag everyone around them into a war that will define the next decade. Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Two men, two visions of power, one unavoidable collision. Masseria, Joe the Boss, is everything his nickname suggests: heavy, greedy, absolutely certain of his own authority, and completely uninterested in any idea that didn't originate in the villages of western Sicily 40 years ago. He controls Manhattan and demands unconditional submission from every Italian criminal operating in New York. Not cooperation, not partnership, submission. He takes a percentage of everything and gives nothing back except the right to keep operating, which he presents as generosity. Maranzano is more complicated and, in certain ways, more dangerous. He arrived in America in the 1920s from Castellammare del Golfo, a coastal town in Sicily with a long tradition of producing men who believe they are destined for greatness. Maranzano genuinely believes this about himself. He is educated, strategic, and possessed by a particular obsession: Julius Caesar. He has read everything written about Caesar, models his thinking on Roman military hierarchy, and speaks about loyalty and command in terms that belong in a history lecture rather than a bootlegger's warehouse. He sees himself as the man who will bring true order to the chaos of Italian-American crime, with himself, naturally, at the absolute top. Luciano has no patience for either of them. He is working for Masseria, yes, but the word working requires qualification. By 1930, Charlie Luciano is one of the most powerful figures in the New York underworld in his own right. His alliances with Lansky, Siegel, Costello, and Vito Genovese give him a network that cuts across every ethnic and organizational boundary in the city. Masseria tolerates him because Masseria needs him. Maranzano watches him carefully for the same reason. Both men sense that the most dangerous person in the room is not the other old Sicilian boss. It is the quiet, well-dressed man in the corner who never raises his voice. The war between Masseria and Maranzano begins formally in 1930, though its roots stretch back years into a tangle of insults, territorial disputes, and the fundamental incompatibility of two enormous egos. It is called the Castellammare's War, after the Sicilian town that supplies most of Maranzano's men. It is brutal, expensive, and stupid. Men dying in restaurant shootings and street ambushes, business interrupted, law enforcement attention drawn precisely where nobody wants it. The violence accomplishes nothing except to demonstrate that neither side can destroy the other quickly. Luciano watches it all with his characteristic patience. He is waiting for the moment when both sides are exhausted enough to accept a solution. The moment comes in the spring of 1931. He approaches Maranzano first. The meeting is held through intermediaries in the careful way that serious men conduct serious conversations. Nothing written down, nothing said directly, everything communicated through implication and understood context. The offer is straightforward. Luciano will remove Masseria. In return, Maranzano will recognize Luciano's position and accept the new structure that Luciano intends to propose once the war is over. Maranzano agrees immediately. He is, in his own mind, agreeing to use Luciano as a weapon, and then, once the weapon has served its purpose, to put it away permanently. He already has plans for this. What he hasn't fully accounted for is that Luciano is thinking at least 2 moves past the conversation they are currently having. On April 15, 1931, Charlie Luciano takes Joe Masseria to lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island. It is a Tuesday. The lunch is long and generous. Clams, spaghetti, good wine, the kind of meal that 2 men share when there is no tension between them, or when one of them is very good at pretending. After the food, they play cards. The afternoon stretches comfortably. At some point during the card game, Luciano sets down his hand and stands up. "I need to use the bathroom," he says. "Deal me out for a few minutes." Masseria waves a hand without looking up. "Take your time." Luciano walks to the bathroom at the back of the restaurant. While he is in the bathroom, 4 men enter through the front door and shoot Joe Masseria 6 times. When Luciano returns to the table, his boss of 15 years is dead on the tiled floor, a playing card fallen from his hand. The ace of diamonds, according to the story that will be told for decades afterward. Whether the card was really there or was added by someone who understood the value of a good detail, nobody can say for certain. Masseria is dead. The war is over on one side. The other side doesn't last long either. Maranzano moves with the speed of a man who has been planning his next move for years. Within weeks of Masseria's death, he calls a gathering of Italian-American crime bosses in a hall in the Bronx and declares himself, with the full weight of his Roman obsessions, capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. The Italian-American underworld, he announces, will be reorganized. There will be order. There will be hierarchy. There will be 5 families in New York, each with its own territory and its own internal chain of command, underboss, captains, soldiers, all of it modeled on the Roman military structure that Maranzano has spent years studying. He assigns the families. He places himself at the top of his own. Luciano leads the second. Vincent Mangano takes the third. Tommy Gagliano the fourth. Joe Profaci the fifth. On paper, it is exactly the kind of rational organization that Luciano has been arguing for. In practice, it is simply a new version of the same old problem. One man at the top of everything, with the title to prove it, making himself the single most obvious target in the entire American underworld. Luciano gives him exactly 5 months. By September of 1931, Maranzano has already decided that Luciano is too dangerous to leave alive. The logic is the same logic that has governed the underworld forever. The second most powerful man is always the most likely source of the knife in your back. Maranzano hires an Irish gunman, a volatile and extremely dangerous man named Vincent Call, to kill Luciano and several of his closest associates. It is not a secret. These things never stay secrets. Word reaches Luciano through Tommy Lucchese, one of his allies inside the organization, and reaches him quickly enough to matter. Luciano calls Lansky. "Maranzano wants me dead," he says. A pause. "How long do you have?" "Not long. He's already made the arrangement." Another pause. Then, "You know what needs to happen." "I know," Luciano says. "I need men his people have never seen." This is the advantage that Maranzano has fundamentally underestimated. Luciano's alliances extend far beyond the Italian world. Lansky and Siegel command networks of Jewish gangsters, men whose faces are completely unknown to Maranzano's Sicilian bodyguards. They are invisible in a way that any of Luciano's Italian associates cannot be. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano calls Luciano and Vito Genovese to his office on the 9th floor of a building at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan. The pretext is a business meeting. The reality, as Luciano already knows, is an execution. Call is waiting somewhere nearby. The meeting is a trap. Luciano springs the counter-trap first. 4 men arrive at Maranzano's office before Luciano and Genovese are due to appear. They carry badges and identification identifying them as agents of the Internal Revenue Service, tax investigators. Maranzano's bodyguards, who have never seen these men before in their lives, have no reason to be suspicious. The IRS is always a possibility for men in Maranzano's business, and nobody shoots federal agents in a Park Avenue office in broad daylight. The guards are disarmed. Then the 4 men go to work on Maranzano, stabbing him 4 times and shooting him twice to be absolutely certain of the result. Maranzano dies on the floor of his own office, the boss of all bosses, the man who modeled himself on Julius Caesar, ending the same way Caesar did, suddenly, completely, and surrounded by men he thought were under his control. When the news moves through the underworld that afternoon, it carries a name: the night of the Sicilian Vespers. The story grows in the telling, as these stories always do. Some accounts claim that Luciano orchestrated simultaneous killings of old guard bosses across the country that same evening, a nationwide purge of the men who still thought in terms of the old country. The reality is more modest, but the reality is enough. In the space of 5 months, Charlie Luciano has removed both poles of a war that was destroying everything around it. He is 34 years old. He is now, without any serious question, the most powerful Italian-American criminal in the United States. And he does something that nobody anticipates. He refuses the crown. No capo di tutti capi, no boss of all bosses, no supreme title, no throne, no single point of authority that everyone else revolves around. He has watched two men die for that title in the same calendar year, and he understood its fatal logic long before either of them did. The title doesn't create power, it creates a target. What he wants is something different, something that has never existed in the American underworld before. He wants a system. Later in 1931, Luciano calls a meeting. Bosses from New York, representatives from Chicago, powerful figures from other cities invited to sit at a table and listen to a proposal. It is, in every meaningful sense, a corporate board meeting. Luciano presents his idea with the confidence of a man who knows he has already won the argument. He calls it the Commission. No more bosses of all bosses, he tells the room. No more wars over who sits at the top. What we're going to have instead is a board. The most powerful families in the country, making decisions together on anything that affects all of us. Territory disputes, whether a boss can be removed, anything that would otherwise end in a war, we bring to the table instead. One of the older bosses from Chicago leans forward. And who decides what comes to the table? The families themselves, Luciano says. Every family keeps its own house. Nobody tells you how to run your business in your territory. But anything that crosses lines, anything that affects more than one family, that's commission business. The room is quiet for a moment. And who enforces the decisions? Luciano looks at the man steadily. All of us do. That's the whole point. The bosses agree. They agree because they are pragmatic men, and pragmatic men recognize a better system when it is laid out in front of them. They have just spent 2 years watching the old system burn through their money and their men and their patience. And the man sitting at the head of the table is offering them something that none of them could have designed themselves. What they don't fully articulate, what perhaps only Lansky, sitting quietly to one side, fully perceives, is that Luciano has built a system in which his own position is unassailable without being declarable. He leads the most powerful family. He has alliances everywhere. He designed the rules. The Commission is not a democracy with Luciano as one vote among equals. It is a structure with Luciano at its gravitational center, dressed up in the language of collective governance. It is the most elegant power grab in the history of American crime. The 5 families of New York are formalized: the Luciano family, the Mangano family, the Profaci family, the Gagliano family, which will eventually bear the name of its most significant leader, Lucchese, and the family previously led by Maranzano, which passes to Joseph Bonanno and takes his name. Each controls defined territory in the 5 boroughs and beyond. Each operates with full independence on internal matters. But above all of them, meeting when necessary, deciding when necessary, the Commission functions as the final authority on questions of consequence. It is a structure elegant enough to survive its creator by decades. By the early 1930s, Charlie Luciano is running the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history. Bootlegging has made him rich. Gambling and prostitution maintain the income as prohibition winds down. And everyone in the business can see that prohibition is winding down. The public appetite for the law has collapsed. Repeal is coming. It comes in December of 1933, when the 21st Amendment ends prohibition and eliminates, at a stroke, the most profitable business the American underworld has ever run. Bootleggers across the country scramble to redirect their infrastructure into other channels: gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering. Luciano, who has been anticipating this for years, has already made the transition. His gambling operations are extensive. His political connections, the judges, the police captains, the aldermen whose campaigns have been quietly funded for a decade, remain intact and functional. He is, by every measure that matters, untouchable, which is precisely the word that a young prosecutor in the New York District Attorney's Office is determined to disprove. Thomas Dewey arrives in 1935, like a man who has been preparing for a single purpose his entire adult life. He is 33 years old, angular, driven, meticulous in a way that borders on the obsessive. He has a thin mustache, a precise way of speaking, and the kind of organized ambition that makes everyone around him slightly uncomfortable because it is so clearly pointed somewhere specific. He is appointed special prosecutor with a mandate that is simple in its statement and enormous in its implication: destroy organized crime in New York. And he begins with the systematic intelligence of a man who understands that complex problems are solved by reducing them to their simplest elements, to identify his primary target. The target is Luciano. The problem is that Luciano is extraordinarily difficult to approach legally. He is careful about what he says and to whom. He does not commit violence personally. There are no witnesses to place him at the scene of any shooting. He does not handle cash directly. He exists at such a deliberate remove from the day-to-day operations of his organization that connecting him to any specific crime requires either an extraordinary investigation or someone on the inside willing to testify against him. Dewey chooses to build both simultaneously. His investigators spend months dissecting Luciano's prostitution operation, not his most profitable enterprise, but the one with the most potential witnesses. The network runs across Manhattan: brothels, booking agents who manage the women and collect the money, enforcers who maintain discipline, layers of management that connect the street level to the top. It is, like everything Luciano builds, structured like a business. And businesses, unlike street gangs, leave traces. The investigators interview dozens of women. Most are terrified. Many refuse to cooperate entirely, and Dewey's people understand why. Cooperation is dangerous in ways that go beyond the legal. But enough talk. And what they describe, piece by piece, across dozens of separate interviews that Dewey's team then cross-references with extraordinary care, is a picture that keeps arriving at the same name at its center. In February of 1936, Dewey moves. In a single coordinated night, his investigators hit over 90 locations across New York City: brothels, booking offices, addresses connected to the network, arresting more than 100 people. It is an operation of stunning logistical scale, and it sends a tremor through the entire underworld. Luciano is in Hot Springs, Arkansas when the news reaches him. Hot Springs is the kind of resort town that has always attracted people who find New York temporarily inconvenient. A place where a man can take the waters, play some cards, and wait for the weather to change back home. This time, the weather doesn't change. Dewey sends people to Arkansas. The extradition is contested, delayed, fought through lawyers, but the machinery of the law, once it gets moving, is difficult to stop entirely. In the spring of 1936, Charles Luciano is returned to New York. Mr. Luciano, one of the arresting officers, says as they put him in the car, "You've had a good run." Luciano looks at him without expression. "We'll see," he says. The trial of Charles Luciano opens on May 13, 1936, at the New York Supreme Court on Center Street. From the first morning, it is a spectacle unlike anything the city has seen. The courtroom fills before the doors open. Reporters from every major newspaper in the country are assigned to it full-time. Photographers crowd the steps outside. The name Lucky Luciano, already well known in certain circles, is about to become known to every household in America. Dewey prosecutes personally. This fact alone tells you everything about the stakes. Special prosecutors with serious political ambitions, and Dewey's ambitions are not a secret, do not stand up in front of a jury themselves unless the case is historic. He is not here simply to convict a criminal. He is here to establish, before the entire country, that organized crime in America has a face, a name, and an address, and that the law is capable of reaching it. The witnesses take the stand one after another over the course of several weeks. Women, madams, bookers, prostitutes, describe in precise and often uncomfortable detail how the network operated. They describe the booking agents who collected money and passed it up through the organization. They describe the enforcers who appeared when a woman tried to leave or refused to work. They describe conversations in which names were spoken, instructions given, the chain of authority made clear. Several of them describe Luciano himself. His defense is consistent throughout. He has nothing to do with prostitution. He is a gambler. He is a businessman. The women are lying, confused, or, and this is the argument his lawyers press hardest, have been coached and compensated by Dewey's office to produce testimony that connects their client to a man they have barely met. The cross-examinations are aggressive. Several of the witnesses have criminal records of their own. Several have made arrangements with the prosecution in exchange for their cooperation on the stand, and Luciano's lawyers make certain the jury knows this. But Dewey has built his case the way a careful architect builds a structure, not dependent on any single load-bearing element, because any single element can be attacked and removed. He has dozens of witnesses whose accounts corroborate each other on the essential points. He has financial records. He has testimony about the movement of money that traces upward through the organization with a consistency that is very difficult to explain away. The jury retires on June 6, 1936. They are back in less than 7 hours. On June 7th, Charles Lucky Luciano is found guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Judge Philip McCook, who has listened to weeks of testimony with visible distaste, sentences him to 30 to 50 years in prison. 30 to 50 years. In practical terms, a life sentence. A sentence designed not merely to punish, but to erase. Luciano stands and listens to the sentence read without visible reaction. He has survived things that would have broken most men. He does not allow a courtroom, or a judge, or a prosecutor who is already writing his political biography in his head, to see anything on his face that he hasn't chosen to put there. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he tells Dewey quietly as they pass each other after the sentencing. Dewey looks at him with the calm of a man who has just won the most important case of his career. "I expect so," he says. He is sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. The other prisoners call it Little Siberia. It sits in the far north of the state, close enough to the Canadian border that the winters are a punishment in themselves. Long, brutal, and gray in a way that wears at the mind as much as the body. It is designed to be as far as possible, in every sense, from the world that produced the men inside it. Luciano refuses to be erased. From his cell in Dannemora, he continues to run his organization with the limited but effective tools available to a man of his connections. Messages move through lawyers. Instructions travel through visitors who know exactly what they are carrying and why discretion is not optional. Frank Costello manages the day-to-day business on the outside with the competence and smoothness that has always made him the ideal executive. He is charming enough to keep the political relationships Luciano has spent years building, and authoritative enough to maintain discipline among men who would test a weaker figure immediately. The organization doesn't collapse, it adapts. This is not an accident. It is the result of the system Luciano designed. A structure built entirely around one man fails the moment that man is removed. The commission, the family structure, the distributed authority, all of it was built, consciously, to survive exactly this kind of crisis. Luciano is in prison. The machine keeps running. But the years inside are slow in a way that no amount of organizational management can fully address. 1937, 38, 39, 40. The world outside is accelerating toward a catastrophe that nobody in Dannemora can stop or influence, no matter how many messages they pass through their lawyers. In Europe, the catastrophe arrives first. By 1939, it is a war. By 1940, it is the most destructive war in human history. And on December 7, 1941, a Sunday morning in Hawaii, it becomes America's War II. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changes everything in America simultaneously: the economy, the culture, the government's relationship with every institution that might contribute to the war effort. The country mobilizes with a speed and completeness that surprises even the people directing it. And somewhere in that mobilization, a problem emerges that nobody in Washington has a clean answer for. The problem is the Port of New York. The port is the logistical heart of the American war effort in the Atlantic, the point through which troops, equipment, ammunition, food, and medicine must pass on their way to Europe. Its security is not optional, it is existential. And in 1942, it is deeply compromised, not by enemy action, but by the fundamental reality of who controls the waterfront. The docks of New York are mob territory. They have been for 30 years. The International Longshoremen's Association, the union that represents the tens of thousands of men who load and unload the ships, operates under the effective authority of organized crime. The bosses who run the union, the men who control hiring and movement on the piers, answer ultimately to the same families that answer to the Commission. The German Navy is operating in the Atlantic with terrifying effectiveness in the first half of 1942, sinking American ships at a rate that is genuinely alarming to military planners. The fear, which is not irrational, is that German intelligence has penetrated the waterfront unions and is receiving information about convoy schedules, cargo manifests, and departure windows. Naval intelligence needs the docks secured, and naval intelligence, working through its offices in New York, arrives at the uncomfortable conclusion that the only way to secure the docks is to ask the people who actually control them. Those people answer to Charlie Luciano. A lawyer named Murray Gurfein makes the initial contact, approaching through intermediaries, first Meyer Lansky, then Frank Costello. The conversation is the kind that doesn't have a written record, for reasons that everyone involved understands perfectly. Lansky brings the proposal to Luciano through his attorney. The message, stripped of its formal language, is this: the United States government needs the waterfront. Will Luciano help secure it? Luciano receives the message in his cell and sits with it for a moment. "They're asking me for a favor," he tells his attorney. "It appears so. The government that put me here is asking me for a favor." Yes. Luciano is quiet for a long time. When he speaks again, his voice is entirely even. "Tell them yes. Tell them I'll do it. And tell Lansky to make sure everyone understands that I'm doing it." "You want them to know you cooperated?" "I want them to remember it," Luciano says. "There's a difference." The arrangement takes effect through 1942. Longshoremen become informants. Suspicious individuals moving through the Union are identified and reported to naval intelligence. The docks of New York, for the duration of the war, are as secure as any facility in the country. There are no significant German intelligence successes traceable to the Port of New York during the war years. Luciano is subsequently transferred from Dannemora, Little Siberia, to Great Meadow Correctional Facility, a less punishing institution. It is not an official acknowledgement of the arrangement. Nothing about this is official, but everyone involved understands what it means. In 1943, the cooperation deepens. The Allied High Command is planning Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the opening of the Southern European Front. When American troops land on the island, they will need to move quickly through a population that is frightened, traumatized by years of war, and deeply suspicious of foreign armies bearing promises. Sicily's loyalties have always run through its own structures, not through governments in Rome or anywhere else. The question reaches Luciano through the same channels as before. Can he help? He can. He makes contact with Sicilian mafia figures through networks that only he can access. Men who have known his family name since before he left Lercara Fridi as a 9-year-old boy. Names are passed. Signals are arranged. Assurances are delivered in the particular language that these particular men trust. When Allied forces land in Sicily in July of 1943, the resistance in certain areas is notably lighter than expected. Local mafia bosses provide guides, intelligence, and a kind of informal community authority that smooths the advance in ways impossible to document precisely, but impossible to dismiss entirely. How much of this is Luciano's doing, and how much is circumstance will be debated by historians for decades. What is not debated is that naval intelligence believed his contribution was real and significant, and that belief, carefully documented, is the foundation on which his lawyers begin to build an argument for freedom. The man who has to decide whether to grant it is Thomas Dewey. The symmetry is almost too perfect to be believed. The prosecutor who spent years building the case that put Luciano away is now, in 1945, the governor of New York, having ridden the fame of that conviction to Albany and nearly to the White House, losing the presidential election of 1944 to Franklin Roosevelt by a margin that almost nobody predicted would be that close. He will run again. He is a man with a future, which means he is a man who calculates every decision in terms of what it costs him and what it earns him. The argument his team presents is documented, specific, and difficult to dismiss. Charles Luciano cooperated materially with the United States government during the most consequential military conflict in modern history. Naval intelligence confirms it. The record is clear. To keep him in prison when men who contributed less to the war effort are walking free is, the argument runs, indefensible. Dewey listens. He considers. He is not a sentimental man, and he is not a man who is easily manipulated by arguments he doesn't find persuasive. But he is also a man who understands when the weight of evidence points in a direction he would personally prefer it didn't. On January 3, 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey commutes the sentence of Charles Luciano. He is released from Great Meadow Correctional Facility and transported under escort to Ellis Island, the same island his family passed through nearly 40 years before, full of hope and nothing in their pockets. The terms are absolute and non-negotiable. Deportation to Italy, permanent. He will be returned to the country of his birth, and he will never set foot on American soil again. On February 9, 1946, Luciano boards a vessel called the Laura Keene at the port of Brooklyn. A gathering of men comes to see him off. Lansky, Costello, Genovese, others who have walked alongside him for 30 years. They eat together in a private room. They drink good wine. By some accounts, the evening is quiet, almost melancholy. The farewell of men who know that something is ending that cannot be recovered. By other accounts, it is almost celebratory, the relief of a man walking out of a cage after 10 years. Probably it is both at once. These things usually are. The ship moves out into the harbor. Luciano stands at the rail and watches the skyline of Manhattan diminish in the gray February light. The skyline of the city he arrived in as a child with nothing, that he climbed to the absolute summit of through intelligence and nerve and a capacity for ruthlessness that never wavered. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, the towers of Lower Manhattan where the money moves and the decisions are made. He watches until he can no longer see it. He is 48 years old. He is never coming back. He lands in Naples in late February of 1946. Italy greets him with the face of a country that has been through something it is not yet ready to talk about. The war has left it physically demolished and morally exhausted. Buildings in rubble, roads destroyed, a government that nobody fully believes in yet, and an economy that functions mostly on improvisation and desperation. The great port city of Naples, with its noise and its chaos and its ancient talent for surviving things that should not be survivable, is in some ways the most honest place in post-war Europe. For a man of Luciano's particular skills, it feels, in a strange way, like home. He does not retire. The idea would not have occurred to him. Within weeks of his arrival, he is moving again, carefully, through intermediaries, at the distance he has always preferred. He re-establishes contact with Sicilian Mafia figures. He builds relationships with Italian criminal networks that have reorganized in the chaos of the post-war years. He attends dinners with men whose names would be recognizable to no one outside a very specific world, and he conducts conversations that produce results weeks or months later in cities he is not present in. He is living in a suite at the Hotel Turistico in Naples. Good rooms, good food, the kind of comfort that a man accustomed to a certain standard of life maintains even when circumstance has reduced his options considerably. He dresses as he always has. He is recognized on the streets of Naples. The neighborhood knows exactly who he is. But there is something different now, a restlessness. The empire is across the ocean, and he is on the wrong side of it. In December of 1946, Luciano takes the most audacious gamble of his post-prison life. He travels to Cuba. Cuba, under the aging Fulgencio Batista, is one of the most convenient countries in the world if your primary concern is operating outside American legal jurisdiction while remaining close enough to America to conduct American business. Havana is 3 hours from Miami by air. The casinos are American-run. The officials are available. It is, in the language of the people who use it, a comfortable arrangement. Luciano checks into the Hotel Nacional under a pseudonym and begins receiving visitors. Over several days in December, the most powerful organized crime bosses in the United States make their way to Havana, traveling individually through different routes, with the careful tradecraft that men in their position apply to sensitive meetings. It is the first gathering of anything resembling the commission since Luciano went to prison a decade earlier, and it carries an energy that everyone present can feel. The agenda has several items: the distribution of narcotics interests, the management of Cuban casino operations, the question of Luciano's formal authority over the American organization, whether, from Havana, he can reassert the direct leadership that prison and deportation have complicated. But the meeting is also consumed, for a significant portion of its time, by a question about a man who is not present: Benjamin Siegel. Bugsy, as everyone in the room has called him since they were teenagers on the Lower East Side, though nobody has called him that to his face in 20 years, because Siegel hates the nickname with an intensity that has always been slightly dangerous to provoke. He is brilliant, violent, charming, and in 1946 he is also deeply, catastrophically over budget on a casino he is building in the Nevada desert, the Flamingo. In Las Vegas, a stretch of flat, sun-blasted nothing in Nevada that Siegel is absolutely convinced will one day be the most valuable gambling real estate in the world. He has borrowed and spent and borrowed again, and the construction costs have ballooned to figures that the men in Havana find difficult to look at without their eyes narrowing. Several of them have invested directly. All of them have heard the same story. The money is disappearing, and some of it is disappearing in directions that suggest it is being directed rather than lost. The word being used, quietly, in certain conversations, is skimming. The debate at the Havana conference, held in a private dining room of the Hotel Nacional, with men seated around a long table and glasses of rum that nobody is drinking very quickly, is about whether to kill Bugsy Siegel. Luciano does not want to kill him. He's building something real, he tells the room. I know Benny. I've known him since we were kids running numbers on Delancey Street. He is not stealing from us. The numbers don't agree with you, Charlie, says one of the bosses. A careful man from the Midwest who has never trusted Siegel's flamboyance and has said so repeatedly for years. The numbers are construction overruns, Luciano says. Any of you ever built anything? It always costs more than the estimate. That's not theft, that's reality. It's 3 times the original budget. Because he's building something that's never been built before. Luciano leans forward. Give him time. Let the casino open. Let it run for 6 months. If it's losing money, we have a different conversation. The room considers this. The Flamingo opens on December 26, 1946. While the conference is still ongoing, the opening night is, by all accounts, a disaster. Rain, technical problems, half the celebrity guests failing to appear. The casino loses money in its first weeks of operation. The conversation in Havana shifts. Luciano argues once more for patience. He is the most persuasive man in the room, and he knows it, and he uses every tool available to him. But he is also, for the first time in his career, arguing against a consensus that has already formed without him. Formed during the years he was in prison, when the relationships in that room reorganized themselves around his absence. He is overruled. On June 20, 1947, Bugsy Siegel is sitting on the sofa in the living room of his girlfriend Virginia Hill's house in Beverly Hills, California, reading the Los Angeles Times. 2 rifle rounds come through the living room window. The first takes out his right eye. The second kills him. He is 41 years old. The Flamingo, under new management, becomes profitable within months. Within a few years, it is one of the most successful casinos in Nevada. Within a decade, Las Vegas is exactly what Siegel said it would be, the gambling capital of the world. He was right about everything except his own survival. Luciano, when the news reaches him, goes quiet in a way that people who know him recognize. He does not make speeches. He does not perform grief. But those who are present in the days after Siegel's death describe a man who sits with his thoughts for long periods and says very little. 40 years. They have known each other for 40 years, since a street on the Lower East Side where two kids with nothing decided that having nothing was a temporary condition. Whatever Charlie Luciano feels in those days, he keeps entirely to himself. The Cuban interlude ends abruptly. Harry Anslinger, the director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and a man who has made the pursuit of Luciano something close to a personal mission, applies pressure on the Cuban government with the blunt efficiency of a man who knows exactly what leverage he has. The United States controls the supply of pharmaceutical drugs to Cuba. Anslinger makes the calculation explicit. Luciano stays, the drugs stop. The Cuban government, facing a public health crisis if it refuses, expels him within days. Luciano returns to Italy in early 1947. The side door is closed. He will never be that close to America again. Back in Naples, he builds. The enterprise he turns his attention to in the late 1940s is different in character from everything he has done before. More invisible, more global, and ultimately, far more destructive in its consequences than anything a bootlegger or a gambling boss could achieve. The heroin trade. The mechanics, as Luciano designs them, are elegant in the cold way that all his operations are elegant. Opium is grown in Turkey and processed into morphine base. The morphine base moves to laboratories in Sicily and southern France, the so-called French connection, where it is refined into heroin. The finished product crosses the Atlantic in shipments concealed within legitimate cargo, managed by men who know exactly what they are handling and exactly what happens to people who draw attention to it. On the American end, distribution runs through the New York families, primarily through channels connected to the Genovese organization. It is a pipeline, and pipelines, unlike street operations, don't require the men at the top to be present. They require engineering and maintenance. Luciano is extraordinarily good at both. Anslinger documents it obsessively. The Bureau of Narcotics builds files, tracks movements, pressures foreign governments, intercepts shipments. Some of those shipments are seized, most are not. The pipeline functions with sufficient reliability to supply American cities with heroin throughout the 1950s, feeding an epidemic of addiction that accumulates damage in neighborhoods far from the hotel suites where the logistics are discussed over dinner. The men who die from that heroin, and the women and the children of those men and women, are not visible in the way that shooting victims are visible. They do not appear in newspaper photographs. They do not produce dramatic trials. They accumulate quietly, over years, in places that the men at the top of the organization never visit and would not recognize. Luciano never confronts this directly, not in interviews, not in the memoir he spends his final years working on. He discusses the mechanics of power, the logic of organization, the injustice of his conviction on the prostitution charges, with a frankness that is sometimes almost startling. On the heroin trade, he is careful. The words he uses are selected. The silences are where the truth is. He spends his last years in movement between Naples and Rome, occasionally Sicily, though the Italian authorities periodically restrict his access to the island, responding to Anslinger's persistent pressure from Washington. He gives interviews. He is photographed. He is, in Naples, something between a celebrity and a fixture, a man whose name everyone knows and whose actual activities nobody with any sense discusses publicly. He works with a journalist and filmmaker named Martin Gosch on the memoir that will not be completed in his lifetime. The conversations that go into it are recorded across many sessions, long afternoons in hotel rooms, Luciano talking with the reflective openness of a man who has spent decades keeping his own counsel and has perhaps grown tired of it. He talks about his childhood in Sicily and the Lower East Side. He talks about Prohibition and the wars and the building of the Commission. He talks about Dewey with the controlled irritation of a man who has decided definitively that he was wronged and who wants the record to say so. He is, in these conversations, exactly what he has always been, completely in control of what he chooses to reveal and completely opaque about the rest. His health declines through 1961. The heart, which has driven him for 64 years through a life lived at a sustained intensity that would have destroyed most people in their 30s, is beginning to fail. Doctors advise him to slow down. He adjusts his schedule and continues working. In January of 1962, Gosch flies to Naples to continue their sessions. Luciano goes to the airport to meet him. On January 26, 1962, in the arrivals hall of Naples International Airport, Charles "Lucky" Luciano suffers a massive heart attack. He dies on the floor. The man who survived a meat hook on Staten Island. The man who survived 2 criminal wars, an assassination plot, a 30 to 50-year sentence, and a deportation. The man who built the most sophisticated criminal organization in the history of the modern world, and then ran it from a prison cell, and then from a hotel room on the other side of the Atlantic, dies on an airport floor, alone, waiting for a friend. He is 64 years old. The Italian authorities release his body for transport to the United States. He is buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, the borough across the river from Manhattan, the city that made him and expelled him. The funeral is attended by men whose names appear in federal files, and by men whose names appear nowhere at all. It is quiet by the standards of the life it closes. The city takes him back in the end, in the only form it was ever willing to accept him, still, silent, and no longer a problem for anyone. What Lucky Luciano left behind is not measurable in the ordinary ways. He built no hospitals. He endowed no universities. He left no art, no scholarship, no institution that a civilized society would recognize as a contribution. What he left is a structure, a way of organizing criminal power that proves so durable, so rationally constructed, so resistant to both internal conflict and external pressure, that it outlived its creator by decades and shaped the behavior of criminal organizations around the world. The commission he designed in 1931 functioned as the governing body of the American Mafia for more than 50 years. The 5 families of New York, battered by prosecutions, weakened by informants, restructured by the relentless pressure of federal law enforcement in the 1980s and 90s, remained recognizable as the institutions Luciano formalized, long after every other element of his world had changed beyond recognition. The principle he established, that criminal enterprise should be organized rationally, run like a business, governed by negotiation rather than pure violence, was studied, consciously or not, by organized criminal groups from Japan to Russia to Colombia. The modern understanding of what a criminal organization can be, structurally and operationally, traces a direct line back to the ideas that a 34-year-old man from Lercara Friedi presented to a room full of skeptical bosses in 1931. There is also the other legacy, the heroin pipeline, the epidemic, the bodies that don't appear in dramatic photographs because they disappear slowly, quietly, in apartments and alleyways, in cities that the architects of the pipeline never visited. These are not abstractions. They are real people, real families, real destruction accumulated across decades, built on infrastructure that Luciano designed and set in motion from a hotel room in Naples. He was not a good man. This is not a complicated statement, and it doesn't require qualification. The evidence of what his organizations did to human beings is overwhelming, documented, and not honestly disputed. But he was, in the particular, terrible, fascinating way that history occasionally produces, an extraordinary one. Meyer Lansky, who outlived him by more than 20 years and died peacefully in Miami in 1983, said of his old friend in one of his own late interviews, "He was the most complete man I ever knew. Not the best, not the worst, the most complete. He saw the whole picture, always. While everyone else was looking at the corner they were standing in, Charlie was looking at the whole city." A boy from a Sicilian mining town arrived at Ellis Island in 1906 with nothing. No money, no English, no connections, no reason for anyone to expect anything from him at all. He looked at America and saw not what it offered to the people who followed the rules, but what it offered to the person willing to write new ones. And then he spent the next 50 years doing exactly that, building from nothing, something that had never existed before and has never quite been replicated since. He called it organized crime. He called it business. He called it with the perfectly straight face of a man who had long since stopped noticing the irony, the American way. Looking at what he built and at what it cost, it is very hard to say he was entirely wrong.